Conquest's estimate was 12 million political prisoners, and these guys through the archives found only 450,000. Conquest's estimate of total prisoners in the prison system in 1939 was 25 to 30 million, and these guys found only 2 million. Alright, so most people pretty much in the world at this point get their information on Stalin's crimes and or Stalin's repressions from a handful of authors, and Robert Conquest is one of those. So Robert Conquest, he's a British guy, and he was a paid agent of the Communist Information Department in England. That department later changed its name to the IRD, the Information Research Department. Now, this is post-World War II. We're talking late 40s and the 1950s. And you can read a little bit more about the IRD and Robert Conquest's history in this pamphlet called Lies Concerning the History of the Soviet Union by Mario Sousa. And that pamphlet also covers the Holodomor and William Randolph Hearst, who was a newspaper magnate in the US back in the 1930s. And it shows how Hearst newspapers were reprinting propaganda regarding Stalin and the Soviet Union taken directly from Nazi newspapers and I'm talking about, by the way, German Nazi propaganda from the 1930s, not neo-Nazis or anything like that. German Hitler Nazi propaganda. And it's a really good pamphlet. I read it, I recommend it. But now, there's something called Khrushchev's secret speech. And Khrushchev gave that speech 3 years after Stalin passed away, at which time he was the leader of the Soviet Union and the head of the Communist Party. And he carried out an agenda called de-Stalinization, which began with this speech. It was a speech that he delivered at the 20th Party Congress. So I would imagine it was in front of thousands of delegates, because generally the Communist Party Congresses include thousands of delegates from all over the Soviet Union, or included back then. In any case, the speech was all about Stalin's repressions, as well as some of Stalin's purported failures as commander-in-chief of the Soviet military during his reign as the leader of the Soviet Union. But a good chunk of it was about the repressions that happened during Stalin's reign. And it got leaked. It got leaked to the Western press like a few days after he gave the speech. And going off the name of it, it was apparently supposed to be a secret speech. But it seems pretty obvious that he wanted it to leak to the Western press and the Western populace. And, I mean, dissecting why Khrushchev gave that speech, what his motives were, is essentially like a whole hour-long video of its own. But once the text of that speech hit the Western press, that's when the IRD and all sorts of Western and anti-communist historians started going completely wild and publishing these numbers and stats that we're so familiar with nowadays. Such as, Stalin was responsible for 20 or 30 or 40 million deaths of Soviet citizens in peacetime, or that there were tens and tens of millions of people just working in the gulags. And by the way, Khrushchev said none of that. You can go on YouTube and you can listen to his speech in English, and you'll see that if he ever cites any figures, it's in the thousands. It's never in the millions. And a lot of it has to do with this or that party member or government official, and if Stalin had good reason to purge them or not. And as far as I saw, the entire second half of the speech was about Stalin's performance as the commander-in-chief of the Soviet military leading up to World War II. So almost half the speech wasn't even about the repressions. But yeah, the speech in general was essentially announcing de-Stalinization. So going back to Robert Conquest, he published a book about a decade after the secret speech called The Great Terror. And like I said, This is one of the principal historians from whose book we now have it in our minds that Stalin was responsible for tens of millions of deaths and all these executions and tons of Gulag prisoners. So that's the basic background of Robert Conquest. And I'm going to show you a video that's very little watched on YouTube from this guy Mario Sousa, who wrote that pamphlet, Lies Concerning the Soviet Union. And he was around at the time that Conquest book came out in the late 1960s. And Sousa is a Marxist-Leninist. He's a Portuguese guy who lives in Sweden. In the second part of the video, I will get to evidence that goes against some of the claims that pro-Stalin Marxist-Leninists such as Sousa tend to use in their arguments on a frequent basis. But to start the video, I'm just going to show you Sousa just tearing apart Conquest book. And I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, and I don't care that Sousa is. What I care about are the facts that he presents. So I can learn from libertarians, I can learn from communists, I can learn from anything in between, as long as they're coming with legit facts and reason. And that's exactly what Sousa is doing here. And what he's analyzing is the second edition of Conquest's book, The Great Terror, which came out just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at the time that the Soviet Union was going through a liberalization period in the early 90s. And Mikhail Gorbachev, the prime minister or the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, finally opened the Soviet archives. And so Conquest comes out with the second edition of his book after the opening of the archives. And he's saying, the archives will prove the stats and figures of my original book completely correct. Or to quote it more specifically, he wrote, while the new material extends our knowledge, it confirms the general soundness of the account given in The Great Terror. The Great Terror being his book. So this is what he wrote within the first few pages of his second edition. So here's what Sousa shows us.
And look, this is only for political prisons he's talking about. It's not including criminals. Just political prisoners in the working camps. And he says, yes, in jail and camps, there was 5 million in 37. And in 37, 38, they arrest 7 million people. It makes 12 million people in the camp. And then they kill 1 million or 2 million. And it's 3 million less. So he put in captivity 9 million people. In 1930, in the end of 1938, beginning of 1939. These kinds of numbers are very dramatic for a normal person. I don't want to be with this Soviet Union, with this socialism, because this is terrible.
So I'm going to summarize the figures he's giving us, just because the audio of the video is bad and he has a thick accent and his English isn't quite perfect. So in the Soviet Union in the late 30s, that's when a large purge of the Communist Party and of the Union in general happened. So there were repressions. So what it's saying is that the work camps, what are often commonly referred to as the gulags in 1938, that there were 12 million political prisoners. That 5 million were already there in 37 prior to this wave of repressions. And then 7 million more were arrested in 37, 38 and shipped to these camps. And then as you can see, it says that 1 million of those political prisoners were executed and another 2 million died in the camps. So it attributes 3 million deaths right there to Stalin. And then looking down in the third row, if we subtract the 3 million who died from 12 million political prisoners, we get 9 million. And Conquest said that if we include common criminals, non-political prisoners, then the total number of people in the prison system at that time would be 2 to 3 times more than the amount of political prisoners, which was 12 million. So if we were to take 12 million and multiply it by 2, we get 24 million. That's why Sousa was mentioning the 25 to 30 million prisoners in the prison system at the time, because that's what Conquest stated, 2 to 3 times more. And Conquest also said that the 25 to 30 million would be a conservative estimate on his part, meaning he thinks there could have easily been more than 25 to 30 million people in the prison system in 1938. So now Sousa's going to go on and compare this 25 to 30 million prison population to the overall population of people in general in the Soviet Union in 1938.
And this is only for the political prisoners, because Conquest say the common prisoners are about 2 or 3 times more than the political prisoners. So you have 3 times more this. You have between 25 million or 30 million people in the working camps. It's crazy, because you must be aware that in this time you have about 170 million people in Soviet Union, and normally, I don't know if it goes for Britain, but normally if you have a population of a country, you have young people, the people in the working age, and all the old people, and this goes for about 1/3. So how is it possible? Because all these people who is in the camps is about the working age. So you see, it's a very a situation that is not credible, because if you have about 1/3 of it's about 60 million people in the working age in Soviet Union in this time, 60 million people, and you have 25 or 30 million people in jail. It's not the people. If you want to make a normal thinking, if you are a professor in the university, if you are a journalist with some honor, and you make some thinking about these numbers, you understand this is not possible.
So his point about the overall population of working age people is an extremely good point. From my rough calculation, based on the working age population in the US in 2018, which I just took to be anyone between the ages of 20 and 60, that came out to be 50% of the US population rather than 30%. So I think his calculation of what percentage of the Soviet population was of working age is too low. Whereas he says it's about 30%, it's likely more to be about 50%. And by the way, the graph and the text that are up on the screen during Sousa's presentation, those are not mine. Those came from whoever uploaded that video originally to YouTube. But I've looked closely at that graph, and it illustrates not 30%, but 50%, like I'm saying. But in any case, he's saying 1/3, 30% of the overall Soviet population at the time would have been 60 million people, the overall population being 170 million. Whereas Conquest is saying that 25 to 30 million people were in prison or in gulags. So Sousa is concluding that half of the working age population, 30 million of 60 million working age people, that half of the working age population were in the prison system, according to Conquest. Not according to Sousa, according to Conquest. But this is what Sousa is showing us about Conquest's calculations. I would say the working age population, rather than being 1/3, would be 1/2 of the overall population of 170 million. So half of 170 million would be 85 million working age people in the Soviet Union in 1938-39. So if we take Conquest's so-called conservative estimate of 25 to 30 million people in the prison system, vast majority of whom would have been working age, so let's just say 27 million, because that's right in between 25 and 30. So 27 million people of working age in the prison system, and the total working age population would have been 85 million. So that's still 1/3 of the entire working age Soviet population. So that's still completely impossible. I mean, if you have 1/3 of the entire working age population then think about how many free working age people, non-prisoners, would have to be working as prison guards or admin roles for the prisons and the prison camps. Essentially just employees of the Soviet prison system simply to be able to keep those 27 million people in prison and in the gulags. And so even though Sousa's math is a little off, his point is still perfectly important and significant here. Now, for those who don't know, the Soviet Union went through a period of rapid, very rapid industrialization. Starting around 1928 into the late 30s, all the way up to 1941 when the Nazis attacked in Operation Barbarossa. And because of this rapid industrialization, they had the capability to manufacture military hardware, which enabled them to fend off the Nazi attack. It was an incredibly close call, very close to Moscow, but without the rapid industrialization in the 30s, they couldn't have done that. Now, industrialization of a country means you have industry spread all throughout the country. Undeveloped countries often have industry only in the capital city or just in a few pockets. But in the late 1930s, at this time, the Soviet Union did legitimately have industry spread all throughout the country, all throughout the Union. So, who's industrializing the nation if 1/3 of the working age population are in prison camps? And if 1/3 to 1/2 of the working age population are either guarding the prisoners, being prisoners, or preparing for war with the Germans as military personnel? So then, who's working in the factories? Who's constructing the electric lines? Who's running the telephone and telegraph cables? Who's constructing tanks, boats, cars, trucks, hydroelectric dams, power stations, oil refineries, gas refineries, paving streets in cities, constructing buildings in cities? And yes, there were prisoners at this time working on infrastructure projects, such as canals, railroads, and roads. But they weren't by and large in cities. They were out in rural areas, basically just digging. The vast majority of these prisoners weren't learning technical skills. They were generally digging earth or flattening earth and things such as that. Very menial tasks. And once those tasks are done, you still have to have people with technical know-how, even just manual laborers with technical know-how, to complete things, like the castings and walls of canals, to complete the railroad tracks. So this is a completely valid point that Seuss is making, and he's definitely showing that Conquest is hugely exaggerating the amount of people in the gulags and in the prison system during the Great Purge.
How many people is dead? How many people died during the Stalin years, And he makes, this is also from the text, from the same, almost the same page in the text here. And he says, he makes some speculations about how you can think of the possibilities of the people who is dying. And he comes to the conclusion that thus you get a figure of 20 million dead, which is almost certainly too low and might require an increase of 50% or so. We're talking about 10 million people, just or so, as the debit balance of the Stalin for 20. So it is incredible. A person can write it and is distributed for the universities in all this Western world and for the journalists, and nobody goes against it.
Okay, so like I said earlier, Gorbachev in 89, I believe 89, opens the Soviet archives to the world. And so these experienced historical researchers, professionals from universities, and these are guys who are not Marxist-Leninists, they go through all the documents they could find from the Soviet penal system during the years that Stalin was in power. And they put their findings into a final report that got published in a prestigious historical journal called the American Historical Review. And so this is what Sousa is going to now show you.
This is a very known, the American Historical Review is a very known newspaper all over the world, and I think one of the best historical newspaper all over the world. They have the money, they can make the research and make very good articles, not only in Soviet Union, but all history in different parts of the world. Interesting. They make a special newspaper just on the Soviet and the research. And these are three people. It's Ashketi from USA, is Wittespoon is from Poland, and Zemtsov from Russia. These people are not socialists, not communists. They just want to make a good job, like researchers. Yeah. And what they came to, it's, well, let me make some propaganda. This is the figures I give in this paper that I wrote for many years ago. It's the same tabel, you know. But here you have a clear picture of what we're talking about. Look, you have this year 39. This conquest told us is about 12 millions, and 3 millions are dead. And this is 12 million political prisoners, and we have 3 times more normal prisoners. So it's about between 25 million or 30 million people in the camp. So look, 1,300,000 people in the working camps. It's quite a different figure. And how many are political prisoners? 454,000. So this is really showing the line of conquest. And look, during all the time, the Stalin time, they have a very, very hard time during the war. And the people get more prisons, and after the war, the situation was very difficult. It's missing 25 million houses. And many people have difficult to find something to work or something to eat. And it was a very, very difficult situation. I'm sure you know about that. And this difficult situation can be that the normal people that should not be a criminal in a normal way is make something, same move to get something he needs. And of course, he gets in prison. And that's 2.5 million as the most in the camps, in the open prisons. You know, they have also this prison that you work outside during the day, and after in the night you go and sleep in the prison. And all the people in this custody is about 2.5 million, as the most in Soviet Union. It's not 30 million as Conquest has said. That's what they find in this American Historical Review.
So what he's talking about there is that the Soviet government during these years knew that the Nazis posed a major and real threat of physical attack to their nation. So the repressions did have some reasoning behind them, that being that the Soviet Union wanted to survive the coming German attack. And we know from having gone through now history that they had not yet gone through at that point, that the Nazis did indeed attack the Soviet Union and almost conquered Moscow. So with the benefit of 2020 hindsight vision, we can easily conclude that the Nazis were a serious threat to the existence of the Soviet Union. Add to that the Nazis very publicly hated nobody more than communists and Jews. So obviously the Soviets had a real problem on their hands at that time. In any case, that's what Sousa's getting at there. But the point is, we see that Conquest's estimates for those in the prison camps and those that died are nowhere near the actual numbers that are presented in this prestigious historical journal by these unbiased historical researchers. So, In 1939, we see a total prison system population of 2 million. Total in the gulags, 1.3 million. Total political prisoners, only 450,000, right? So Conquest's estimate was 12 million political prisoners, and these guys through the archives found only 450,000. Conquest's estimate of total prisoners in the prison system in 1939 was 25 to 30 million, and these guys found only 2 million. I believe Conquest said that 3 million in 38 had died. Well, we see here that only 90,000 died. And in 1939, only 50,000 died in the prison system, which includes the gulags. So, okay, let's take 1938, when 90,000 died in the prison system, and we'll round that up to 100,000, versus Conquest saying that 3 million died that year. So he overestimated by 30 times, meaning the actuality was 1/30th of Conquest's estimate. 1/30th. That's about 3% of the amount that Conquest estimated. So essentially, through those figures, Conquest's estimate is about 97% wrong. But to play it safe and make sure we're not overestimating, because we are talking about various different figures here, gulag populations, deaths in the prison system, executions. So the percentage varies for how off the mark Conquest is for each of those categories. But generally speaking, if we take all categories into account, we can safely say that he's 95% off the mark with regards to Stalin's repressions, crimes, etc. And again, this is not coming from Mario Sousa's tabulations and calculations. Sousa is just quoting from the calculations of professional historical researchers without a major political bias either way. Sousa has a political bias, but these historical researchers who put together the study didn't. J. Arch Getty, who was one of the 3 historians who put out the study, you can watch clips of him and interviews of him on YouTube, and you'll see that he has an extremely balanced and detailed perspective. He does not have a political bias, as far as I can tell. He seems to just be interested in what happened and what didn't happen. So, to be 95% off the mark, for a guy who's been considered an authority on Stalin's crimes and on the Stalin-era Soviet Union, for the entire Western world since at least 1968, when the book came out, and an authority for pretty much the entire world since the fall of the Soviet Union, is absolutely absurd. But we're talking about a guy who worked for the Communist Information Bureau in England. So now we're going to take a look at a clip where Sousa shows us that in the second edition of Conquest's book, which came out in 1990, Conquest acknowledges that the archives are accurate, that the Soviet archives are accurate. So let's take a look at that.
And Robert Conquest writes here in the beginning of the book, while the new material extends our knowledge, it confirms the general soundness of the account given in the Great Terror. This imperialism never disarms. Never. If they disarm, they die. If they disarm, there are no more profits. They never disarm. So they make a new book, and this book is for free for thousands of people in universities and journalists in the big newspapers all over Europe, all over the world, for free. And not for me. I buy it, of course. But I know the people in the University of Uppsala, the researchers, they got it for free.
So what Sousa just showed you is a quote from one of the very first pages of the second edition of Conquest's book, which was published in 1990. So basically just after Gorbachev's opening of the archives in 1989. So Conquest doesn't even bother to wait for the expert historians to look through and report on the data from the archives. And he says, in no uncertain terms, the new material from the archives, the newly released material from the archives, confirms our original estimates on Stalin's crimes in the original edition of the book. The original edition of the book had come out about a decade after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. So in the second edition of the book, Conquest doubles down on his figures from the 1960s. And whether Conquest took this blurb out of subsequent editions of his book, The Great Terror, possibly in the late 90s, the 2000s, or the 2010s, I don't know. But it doesn't matter, because he put it here, and we all see it. So he's stuck with having said that, with having printed that in the first few pages of the edition that he put out just after the opening of the archives, and before he allowed Arch Getty and the other researchers the chance to compile the data, the actual data. So, it doesn't matter if you personally think the Soviet archives were falsified, because Conquest didn't think they were. He said they were accurate. And if you're someone who thinks that Stalin caused the unnatural deaths of 25 to 30 million Soviet citizens, then, you only think that because you got that figure from Conquest. Whether you got it directly from Conquest's book, or whether you had it indirectly passed on to you by reading or watching another source who had gotten their figures from Conquest. Either way, the 25 to 30 million figure came from Conquest. There are a handful of other historians who printed figures just as wild as Conquest, and sometimes more exaggerated than Conquest figures. So it's possible you got the figures from one of those researchers, authors. But those guys were likely influenced by Conquest, since Conquest's book came out in '68. And some people might say, oh, well, Solzhenitsyn, he's the real deal. He's not Western. He grew up and lived in the Soviet Union, and I believe he even spent some years in a Gulag prison camp during Stalin's reign. But being a Soviet citizen and serving time in the gulags doesn't mean that your figures are correct. Let's say Solzhenitsyn's figures were double Conquest figures across the board. Okay, well, we already know that Conquest was 95% off the mark, so that would make Solzhenitsyn 99% off the mark. What are people thinking? That because this guy spent time in a gulag, that he was able to count the actual prisoners, how many died, how many got executed, etc., throughout the whole Soviet Union, throughout Stalin's whole entire reign as General Secretary of the Communist Party? All right, but let's go to another quote from Conquest's book that Susa's going to show us, and which shows how absurd Conquest is.
He writes that historical truth is hearsay and rumor. He writes, no particular credence can be attached to official pronouncements, many of which indeed are extravagant falsehoods. The truths can thus only percolate in form of hearsay. He say that about Soviet Union. And of course, not all hearsay and not all rumor is true. On political matters, basically the best, sought not the infallible source is rumor at high political or police level.
What Conquest is saying here is that rumor and hearsay are the best sources for putting together data and for compiling the true accounts of what happened in the past in the Soviet Union. He's apparently a historian, a historical researcher, saying that rumor and hearsay are the best sources. So he probably says this in the second edition because he knows he lied in the first edition, so that he's extremely uncertain that the figures from his 1968 book are going to match the figures that come out from the Soviet archives. Or maybe he's certain that his 68 figures will not at all match the figures from the Soviet archive. But at the same time that he says that the new data from the archives will confirm my original estimates, and obviously all the data from the Soviet government archives would have been quote-unquote official pronouncements, right? So he's saying that those official pronouncements confirm my original 1968 data, and yet he also somehow says, but the truth can only come from hearsay and rumor. He writes those two things in the same book. And that's the historian that the majority of people on Earth trust when it comes to the repressions of Stalin. All right, but now before I show you other evidence that actually goes counter to some of the claims made by pro-Stalin Marxist-Leninists such as Mario Sousa, before I go into all that, I just want to show you Sousa's explanation or description of when the archives opened up. Just because I think it's a pretty good description of how it all went down in 1989.
A big campaign to make the Gorbachev open the Soviet archives. Archives. And Gorbachev is pressed to open the archives because the archives were not closed. It's just they opened for Soviet research, but not research of other countries. But Gorbachev opened the archives, and all these people who was making stories about Soviet Union, they say, the day they open the archives, you will find that we are telling the truth. We are telling the truth. And they say this during 40 years. And nobody could think that someday they are really going to open the archives. That's why they could say that. Okay, open the archives. Oh, no, of course. Now Gorbachev opened the archives. And this is like a piece of sugar for the flies in all Europe. So these groups of researchers from Europe, from France, from Poland, other countries, I think also from England, from Portugal, and from the USA. It came to make this research in the Soviet archives. And this is very important. But meanwhile, I think the CIA and Robert Conquest understood that now is a dangerous position. It's a dangerous position. He's going to discover that these stories we're making are not true. You have the archives. So what imperialism do? They give you another book, the same book, telling this is the truth, and this is what is have been in the archives. That's it, what it makes. It makes the same book with the same figures. The same figures. And everything the same.
Like I said earlier, Sousa was alive when the secret speech happened, and he would have been of a thinking and aware age by 1968 when Conquest's first book came out, so that he would have witnessed more and more Western historians and Eastern Bloc defector historians parroting and exaggerating upon what Conquest put out in the Great Terror. So that Sousa likely witnessed this transformation in the Western public's perception of Stalin, to where Stalin had become 30 times worse, statistically speaking, than he had been just a decade earlier. And Sousa tells us that he remembers them, the historians, constantly saying, when the archives open up, we'll be proven right. And like I said, Sousa, he's a Marxist-Leninist, he's very pro-Stalin, but it doesn't matter. I'm not going to cancel him for that, because here he's showing us evidence put forth by impartial historical researchers. If you want to check those three names out, Archgetty from the US, the Polish researcher, the Russian researcher, the three that put out the report in the American Historical Review in '93, and I can link that study in the video description if you remind me. But go ahead and check them out. Those researchers, look into their background. You're going to find that they're not socialists. So now that we've seen the real figures that show us that guys like Conquest are 95% off the mark, what we should be doing is looking into that other 5% on which he wasn't off the mark, or that once we acknowledge that conquest was way off the mark, it's also important that we acknowledge that there were repressions, that the Soviet government did go overboard during the Great Purge of 36 through 38, or whichever years exactly it was in the 30s, that there were political prisoners in gulags, and that there were executions that went way overboard in 37, 38. They didn't go overboard to the extent Conquest tries to make us believe, but they went overboard. And unfortunately, that debate or that discussion rarely ever happens regarding the other 5%. In other words, zeroing in on that 5% rather than debating and discussing the 95% that never actually existed in the first place. And I think the main reason we rarely ever see that discussion take place, at least in the online English-speaking world, I mean, that's what I can speak to, but it seems to be because Marxist-Leninists are so busy debunking claims made by the rest of us, or other people, who are really just parroting Conquest and Solzhenitsyn and their figures, whether directly or indirectly. They're sort of just hurling false figures at these Marxist-Leninists without knowing that they're false figures. And so the MLs, for people who aren't in the Marxist world, ML just means Marxist-Leninist. So the MLs just sort of are constantly in a defensive stance, and they feel compelled to respond and correct people on their false data. So, they're putting a lot of time and energy into that debate, and there are actually other pitfalls that a lot of MLs fall into, but those aren't really worth mentioning here. The point being that we never really get to the debate or discussion of what percentage of that 5% that Conquest was correct on that actually happened. What percentage of those cases were justified and what percent were unjust and unnecessary? And what was unjust and what was unnecessary, there might even be wiggle room between those two categories. But that's what the whole discussion should be about, this stuff. Because we know the Soviet Union was legitimately dealing with threat of a Nazi invasion, with Nazi fifth columns within the Union, within the party, within the government structures, etc. So some of the repressions, some of the purge may well have helped the Soviet Union successfully fight off the Nazi invasion, which means that those specific repressions of those specific people were at least somewhat justified. But again, the discussion that needs to happen is basically what percentage were indeed justified and what percentage were not. I mean, we do see debate within the Marxist world over the high-profile cases that happen during that purge and during that time period of the mid to late 30s. The high-profile party members, government officials, police officers, etc. But other than the high-profile cases, just like specific individuals, I really don't see much discussion of the percentages and ratios of justified repressions with regards to all the rest of it. Those who were not known officials throughout the entire Union, other than from guys like J.R. Getty, who they get paid to do historical research and they can spend all day on it. But, okay, moving on from that, there's one fact that I see Stalinists constantly citing in their arguments, and it's a very convincing piece of evidence on the surface, and it's in regards to the trial of the 21, which took place in 1938. So this was a trial mainly of officials in the upper echelons of the secret police and the Communist Party. And so this one piece of evidence is that the U.S. ambassador at the time, this guy Joseph Davies, who had attended the entirety of the trial, which, there were plenty of Western observers there. And so he was one of those observers, and he reported back to the U.S. government that the trial had appeared to him to be 100% legit, and that the testimony of the defendants, who all ended up admitting their guilt to sabotaging the Soviet Union, its industry, its food production, admitting to being part of an anti-Soviet Trotskyist bloc, which was plotting to overthrow the Soviet Union and thus the will of the Soviet people. And Davies said that all of these admissions of guilt from the defendants and all of the evidence brought against them throughout the trial seemed completely on the level and legit to him. And this was the US ambassador, the head guy in Moscow representing the US government. Now, these Marxist-Leninists who often use Davies as part of their argument, and it's often the most convincing piece of evidence in their argument, at least for me, it carried a lot of weight. But they likely don't know much at all about Joseph Davies. Because for them, what this guy is he's not a Marxist, he's not a socialist, he's just the typical US ambassador, an ambassador from a major Western capitalist nation. So he's essentially someone without a leftist bias, without any sort of bias towards favoring the Soviet Union, who observed the trial and reported back that it was totally legit. But I'm going to go a little deeper into Davies, who he was, what his motivations were, and we're going to see a bit of a different story there than that from the Stalinist ML perspective, which it's super interesting, at least it was for me researching it. So we're going to take a look at Davies and all that in the next part of this video, and we're going to go from there. So please subscribe and like, and I'll see you in part 2.